Today, we are talking about Dr. Marie Equi, and this is a little bit of a laundry list of her life and why we still talk about her today, even though she died in 1952. So as you can see, those first 20 years of her life, though, that's what we're going to talk about today. So just to really go over some of the other things you might have heard her in discussion with are her medical practice, her public relationship with Harriet Specker and the child that they adopted together. And then in 1906, she also was one of the first responders at the San Francisco earthquake and received a Medal of Honor from the US Army for her work there. Her work in women's suffrage, progressivism, and anarchy in the socialist movement, as well as her private medical practice, where she did process abortions and other standard medical procedures of the time. And then eventually became interested in prison reform when she finally was able to get out of San Quentin prison. She was also a convicted felon, convicted of sedition, something we're a lot more familiar with now than when I started doing this research. And it's fascinating to see just how that topic has changed over the last 100 years. Fortunately, in 1933, she was pardoned by FDR. Interestingly, even though she previously fought for women's suffrage, because of this felony conviction, she was unable to vote until that felony conviction was overturned. And then in 1952, at around age 80, she died of natural causes and was entombed with Harriet Specker in Oregon. And that's the short list. I'm going to read this quote. "Aren't we all a patchwork of ancestral and environmental expressions?" Dr. Marie Equi, page 15, Marie Equi, Radical Politics and Outlaw Passions by Michael Hellquist. This is what Dr. Equi believed to be true of herself. And using this framework, we can look at her life's patchwork of ancestors and environments to understand a little better where she came from. A New Bedford that her parents had immigrated to, and one that was changing. So, what does anyone here know about New Bedford in the 1850s to 1870s? Does anybody have any ideas?
Petty Green.
Petty Green, yes, totally. That was huge on the landscape happening. Any others? Yeah, absolutely, because of, whale oil. Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else before we keep moving?
So the 54th Regiment was very important during the Civil War.
Yep, you're absolutely right. You guys know your New Bedford history, and I'm so glad to hear it, because that means you understand what was going on in the city during this time. This is when Marie's parents immigrated, her father from Italy and her mother from Ireland. This is when they met the city of New Bedford. And so it's a really important time in the city when we're looking at how Dr. Marie Equi grew up. This is the setup. This is the prologue for her life. And so it's important that we understand her parents grew up seeing what was happening in New Bedford and still decided to get married and have children in the city anyway. So I think it's pretty interesting, given some of the things we're going to discuss. So one of the other aspects of New Bedford at that time, which wasn't different from a lot of other places during the 1800s, was homosocial environments were incredibly common. And they're based on perceived gender as established by dominant cultural norms. So someone who is assigned a gender at birth has to live through physical spaces and intellectual constraints of that gender as assigned at birth. So this occurred in schools, churches, synagogues, mills, boarding homes, social clubs, organizations, brothels, financial, judicial, and political institutions, whaling, and other controlled spaces. Throughout this time, industrialization and payment of women's labor outside the home, coupled with women's suffrage movement, allowed new ways for working class and educated white non-queer women to leave these spaces, where people, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color often already survived by transgressing these spaces in one way or another. Additionally, homosocial environments could be a space for platonic and or romantic friendships between and among queer and non-queer people. And it's that I find really fascinating about homosocial environments in New Bedford at that time. You have things like the Ladies Port Society, and you have things like whaling vessels where you have supposed gender norms that are being enforced. And when you kind of divide the sexes, so to speak, to use the old-fashioned terminology, you're always going to find variance within those spaces. And I think Marie was one of those people who was able to find that variance. And we're going to keep looking at her and a few other folks throughout her life that may have showed her how to live in multiple spaces at once. Another thing that was happening, as we were talking about recently, was we have a huge population of self-emancipated people during the 1830s. And by huge, I mean it's proportionate. There's a 16,000 residents in the city, and about 400 are self-emancipated from slavery. And that is a concept in the city that cannot be escaped. New Bedford itself was on the abolition and anti-slavery speaking circuit, posters, newspaper articles, talking whether positive or negative about these actions are in the city as Marie's family's growing up and learning about what is this land America and what is happening. So you had notable speakers such as Francis Ellen Watkins Harper, William Lloyd Garrison, and of course, Frederick Douglass, who with his wife lived here at the Nathan and Polly Johnson House on 7th Street, not far from here as well. So the fabric of the city is, as Marie says, a patchwork. You're seeing different kinds of people intermingling isn't quite the right word. I guess it's like parallelly growing, maybe. I don't know if that explains it. And I think the thing that's interesting to remember is that in 1853, when Marie's father, Giovanni Equi, arrived in New Bedford, and he was 12 years old, there were most likely no other Italians in the city besides his older cousin, Dominic. And at that time, you can imagine what kind of an unsettling space that might have felt for a young person to then have to decide he's going to grow up here and make the best of it. And then Sarah Mullins, Marie's mother, immigrated in the 1850s at around age 9 from British-ruled Ireland, where she was already pretty incensed with the British rule at age 9 still. And Marie remembers her mother talking about that difficulty of having someone in the government tell you how you can live and how that's going to affect your day-to-day life. And while growing up, both Sarah Mullins and John Equi would have witnessed at least heard gossip about the mustering of the 54th, the accumulation of Hetty Green's wealth, and seen the full strength of the whaling industry before its demise, and then including the stone fleet of the Civil War and Arctic disaster in 1871. And so Marie's born in 1872. You can imagine that that entire time in the city was this turbulent experience where people were seeing mills starting to rise, seeing some diversification of wealth, but also really coming to grips with what not being a whaling industry-led city meant for the environment here. Sarah and John Equi, who had anglicized his name to accommodate the local area's accent, they married here in New Bedford in 1866, just 1 year after the Civil War ended. So you can kind of imagine what that year might have been like. Further research would be seeing how many people got married in 1866. Right. I definitely think that that's an interesting thing to think about, much like coming out of deep quarantine, the wedding industry really saw a little bit of a boom. And so Marie Diana Equi is born on April 7th, 1872 on South 2nd Street. And the Equi's family home was actually Dominic's home, where he and his wife and family lived. So in a very old world Italian way, the family lived together. There were multiple generations and multiple families under one roof. Marie remembers like really busy meal times with cousins and uncles and like just having a very boisterous environment. Unfortunately, the Equi home, along with countless others and entire neighborhoods, was swallowed up under the urban renewal project to create Route 18. However, shortly after her birth, Marie was baptized at St. Lawrence Martyr Catholic Church, and that was the family's church, and also one her father had helped lay the foundations for. So he felt a real sense of personal pride in that. So I definitely think about them every time I see that church. John Equi worked as a stonemason, and Sarah Mullins Equi worked in the textile mills in her earlier years, though by the 1880 census, she's listed as a homemaker. The Equis had 11 children over 16 years, and 3 died before Marie was 10. So again, in Marie's early life, she's experiencing all those children around her and then losing some. So she understands viscerally what it's like to make it through by scratching around, by having to provide for so many mouths, by really understanding what the industrialized city is meaning for the people who are being industrialized. By 1880, the city's population had increased to about 2,600, and I'm sorry, 26,000, due to the industrialization that we were experiencing. Irish, French, Canadian, and Polish, in addition to Azorean Portuguese and Cape Verdean and Anglo populations, were the major contributors. Relatively few, if any, Italian people had moved to New Bedford at the time. Any Italians who later settled in New Bedford to work in the industrial mills, including some of my own family, lived mostly in the Holy Acre, an area now also under Route 18. During Marie's lifetime, the Holy Acre would have mostly been an Irish population. And here, you can pause for any questions folks might have, either in person or in the chat. We good? All right. And I'm just going to remind us again of what Marie says about herself. Aren't we all a patchwork of ancestral and environmental expressions? We just started looking at some of the world she was born into, some of the things her parents experienced and brought with them into their marriage. So let's see what else we have to talk about. Now we get to more of the industrialization aspect. Because starting in the 1830s, whaling merchants began diversifying their funds into less risky cotton fabric production. And like most of the other mills in the Northeast, those in New Bedford did get their cotton from Southern plantations as well. And these were vertically integrated textile mills, meaning that the owners controlled virtually all of the aspects of the mill from top to bottom. And so working in this kind of environment, you have a very industrialized society meeting with new immigrants maybe for the first time, this kind of clash of maybe work ethics and culture and what the expectations in a Quaker and Protestant place like New Bedford is like. Work in the mills was racially segregated at best and exclusionary at worst, with English and some Irish at the top, with the best jobs and the ability to join unions. Irish, French, Canadian, Polish, Azorean, Portuguese, and Cape Verdean mill workers were most often not allowed in the unions if they were allowed in the mills at all. Michael Helquist writes that Marie recalled her father had hosted striking workers at their home for dinner, and it got me thinking about which strikes that was. And after a little bit of back and forth, I'm pretty sure it was the Wamsutta strikes of 1877. Marie would have been about 5 years old. She's got a fuzzy memory of it. And based off of where she lived, and I'll show you that on the map in a little bit, and kind of in relation to Wamsutta, I think it makes great sense that that was it. But there were other strikes happening at the time. So Wamsutta opened in 1848, and it was actually named for Metacomet's brother, who we discussed back in our land acknowledgement. Wamsutta is the name of Metacomet's brother, who was also killed during what some historians now call King Philip's War. And the Wamsutta mills are still partially standing and are now loft apartments, and you can see them as you're leaving the city on Route 18. So the Wamsutta Mill strike in 1877 was in response to the third wage cut in 3 years, which I think we can all really understand how that might have affected, say, a family living next door to Marie. While her family might have been stonemasons, they were not necessarily working in high finance. They weren't necessarily working in, I mean, the city was building buildings, that's for sure, but they're not desk laborers. They're hard workers. They're working class folks. And so they can understand that plight that people in the mills are having. And during that strike, in the book, The Strikes of 28, there's also a reference to this strike of 1877. And there's a discussion of William Henry Johnson, a previously emancipated resident here in New Bedford, who was also a lawyer. And he gave some legal advice to the workers who were striking during this 1877 strike. And I was, just to be redundant, struck by the kindness of this lawyer's actions in seeing other people struggling for better treatment. He was able to also offer that. And it's, from what I can tell, it's not, he didn't provide any official legal records. So I'm still not sure where that information's coming from, but it's something I'm continuing to look into. So you're looking here at the obituary of William Henry Johnson here from the Evening Standard. And I just want to say he was also a part of the Temperance Society and a member of the Schooler Guards, which was a military drill group. So he's very active in the local community and society as well. So I'm not surprised when you start looking into his life that he was still really aware of things going on in his neighborhood, including other people striking. Bringing it really close to Marie, this is a quote that one of her school teachers is recorded saying, and it also comes from Hellquist's book, Radical Politics and Outlaw Passions. Mary E. Austin, and that's one of Marie's teachers, I believe at the Middle Street Grammar School, thought her young students' devotion to studying mitigated her lack of self-control and frequent misbehavior. She judged Marie as an excellent scholar with whom she enjoyed long, earnest talks. Away from the classroom, Marie regretted acting out and tried to achieve the self-control she saw others exhibit. I just want us all to sit there with that quote for a minute. And however far away you are from the school experience, please remember back to what it was like, because I think we can all really identify with Marie in this moment. And it strikes it really close to home. And I wonder what Marie's lack of self-control meant from her high school teacher's perspective. Growing up gay or queer or trans is dangerous today. And many of us are lucky to have peers or mentors we can trust. And I can only imagine 110 years ago, this was excruciatingly different. And yet somehow Marie was able to have a connection with at least one adult in her life who helped her in school. Even if she never graduated high school, she still was affected by these lessons with Mary Austin. And I think that that's important, that Mary Austin also remembered Marie Equi later on and was able to share some information about her. From the person Marie came to be, I also wonder what passionate declarations she made in the classroom. How exactly did she misbehave? Did any of these interactions have a root in her queerness? And additionally, how did her Catholic and Italian family influence how she communicated in an Anglo-Protestant secular institution? And from what I can tell, Marie and her siblings may have been the first in her family to attend a public school. So I think when we look at all of this, it really helps us to understand what young people growing up in industrialized New Bedford might have been experiencing. And it honestly feels very similar to today sometimes. And I think it's remarkable that we're able to see this even just in the scraps of Marie Equi's life in New Bedford. I know I brought more questions than answers, but as opportunities for queer studies expand, it's important to think about how folks came to understand themselves, how they were able to move through each day. And this is a constant question I bring to my own research as a queer person, and in studying the environment of Dr. Equi's childhood means understanding some of the supports or struggles she lived with. One of the other supports she had came in high school. She was able to complete 1 year of high school and then was forced to work in the textile mills again in 1886. In 1888, Massachusetts passed laws limiting the hours children were allowed to work in the mills. Anybody want to guess how many hours a child could work in 1888 in Massachusetts?
60.
A day?
No.
Oh, okay.
Movie.
Oh, I'm so glad. It's only 10. It's only 10 hours a day. We had some great shouts of 12 hours a day. So we can imagine that Marie probably was working 12 to 14 hours a day instead of going to school, where it's clear she was very interested in the support she was receiving there. And so if we remember back to that 1 year Marie was in high school, she grew close to Betsy Holcomb of Holcomb's Groceries, who you see here from the 1875 New Bedford Directory. And Betsy was a senior to Marie's freshman and helped Marie complete a second year of high school after she left the mills. They got together over letters and conspired to write write for some grants and some scholarships, and got Marie funded to go to the Northfield Seminary for Ladies, which was about 150 miles northwest here of New Bedford. And so she had 1 more year of high school in 1899. But when when she and her parents could no longer afford schooling, she was put up with having to go home, go back to the mills, and she couldn't bring herself to do that. And I think a lot of people can understand what that might be like. I just know personally, and from some of my other compatriots' experiences, queer folks in the city have been told that there isn't a place for us and it's probably better if we go somewhere else because we'll be happier. We'll find something else, something better. And it's phenomenal to be told that from the people in your community, that there isn't a place, that there's somewhere else out there for you. So I do wonder how much of that kind of conversation Marie had. Because Marie doesn't just like go somewhere else. She gets on a boat and goes back to her family in Italy for 2 years, where she spends time on her uncle's land and works in a vineyard for a while, apparently. So I just imagine she did a little bit of soul searching, really tried to figure out where on the whole planet she could make a life for herself. And she decides to come back to New Bedford after that, despite it all. And when she gets back, she finds out that Betsy has left. She's gone. She's not in Massachusetts at all. She's on the other side of the continent, and she's in Oregon. And she'd taken advantage of the Oregon Donation Land Act, which was a legal stance by the federal government to take away the land of the Waco and Washroom people there and give it to settlers, which now at this later stage in the settlement of the West included single white women. So now the government was happy to give single white women land. You didn't have to be married. And this actually benefited folks like Betsy, who decided, hey, I'm not going to make it in New Bedford. I might as well homestead for 5 years. And that's what she and Marie did. While Marie was helping homestead on the land, she was also going through medical school, and Betsy was supporting her while Betsy was teaching. They lived together for about 5 years after the homestead, and eventually Betsy married a man and had a child. And then we go back to that list of all the things Marie Equi did. So I'm not going to run you through all of that now. Right here, though, is where we can talk a little bit about the places and the people I mentioned. If you see that purple line there, that's South 2nd Street. And this is a great image from, I believe it's, can I see that? Oh, no, I think it's 1876 this image is from, which is 4 years, 1876. Thanks, Jen. That's 4 years after Marie was born. So I love using this little piece of imagery because it's probably pretty close to what Marie's smallest mind would have picked up on at that time. The orange dot you see there is Holcomb's Grocery, where Bess's family ran a grocery store. And the green dot you see is the 54th Regiment's mustering location at Toby and Cogsall, now near Custom House Square. And then the red dot there is where William Henry Johnson's law offices were. And that was a confusing bit of research to find because the building has moved. So it was very exciting. If you're into that, we can talk later. And then the last little bit of Marie's life that I love sharing is this 1880 census of her family. What I didn't quite mention in some of this discussion was that by 1880, her family had moved up to James Street. So you can see that they were upwardly mobile. They definitely were able to get their bigger house in order. This was after Dominic had died. So I do think that there was an interest in selling the family property that they'd lived in since John was 12. I can understand that there might have been a lot of reasons to move. What I find interesting, though, is this is the time where we start seeing Sarah Mullins being listed as a housekeeper. And it's also part of the time where we see Marie having to start working in the mills. So this upward mobility is not necessarily a better thing for the Equi children. And I think that's an interesting way to talk about how people are able to move their capital in this interesting time of industrialization and growing middle class discussions that we are having, at whose expense is that upward mobility happening. And then just to further identify some interesting things in a census, this is a mixed neighborhood. We see a Black family next door whose originated or land of origin was Virginia. So I think that it's great to see that Marie's still in contact with different people in her direct neighborhood, and that comes into play later on in her life. And then just to really shout out what's happening with New Bedford's queer and trans youth today, March 3rd, 2023, so that's this month, New Bedford High School students protests to ask local legislators and school committee members to denounce John Oliver, newly elected to Ward 3, who posted offensive memes they're calling transphobic, and that's from the New Bedford Lights reporting. Then on March 8th, city councilors paid little attention to New Bedford High protesters and their supporters at Oliver's swearing in last Friday. Oliver won his race with a very healthy margin, 57 to 43%, will be represented the city's only historically gay bar, a Ward 3 establishment where many transgender folks frequent, also from the New Bedford Light. And then tonight at 7 p.m., if you're interested, you can chat with those very New Bedford High LGBTQ protesters. There's a conversation being hosted by the New Bedford Light, who's not sponsoring any of this, at newbedfordlight.org. I just think it's incredibly relevant to talking about youth disrupting in schools. It's definitely something Marie would support. And March 31st is Trans Day of Visibility. So please go buy your trans friends and family dinner or send them some extra cash and gift cards, or donate to local drag performers, queer or trans individuals. If you vote this coming year at all, please support folks who don't want to harm us, help us access safe housing, medical care, and food. We're asking family, friends, and neighbors to stand with us as allies.
Where is the?
It's on Zoom. So you can find more info at newbedfordlight.org, and you can sign up and access it there. Thank you for asking. That's the bibliography, also available to share later. I want to thank Don Salerno and Lexis Calvin-Rakowski for meeting with me last year and coordinating to make this a reality. Thank you. And thank you all of the RJD staff and volunteers for supporting this event. Thank you all for attending in person and virtually. Thanks to Dan Everton and Jen De Silva for their advisement and edits on the original research used to develop this presentation. Thank you to Leah Hoshi and Franny Keeley for helping with this version. And thank you to Donald Savino Grampy for first telling me about the Equis all these years ago. Any upcoming collaborations you can find me at are with New Moon Dance Party, Queer Arts Council, or Queer Archive Work. And you can find all of those organizations listed as such, either on social media or on a website with those names. And you can find me at Marie Equi Zine Library on Instagram, on Library Thing, or at gmail.com. And if you'd like to take the Queer Art History Tour of New Bedford, you can visit qacnb.com. I'm also seeking a guest curator for Body, Body, Body on May 6th. I'm also booking for June and July. Questions?
She was a doctor.
She was a doctor. That was her everyday practicing profession. However, she was known to stop in the middle of her practice and run out to the streets and join a protest to either lend her professional voice and opinion, either using medical knowledge as a doctor to say, hey, that industrial practice is dangerous. This is before we had OSHA violations as a concept. So she's one of those folks who would hear firsthand from her working class patients rush to the street to do something about it. She was also incredibly most infamous for her anti-war protests, protesting World War I, in which she decorated her own vehicle as a float, drove it into the parade, and then at a later date scaled a lamppost to release a protest flag. Sedition.
And so what was that about?
I'm definitely going to encourage you to go read Michael Helquist's book, because tonight's research is about New Bedford and how she experienced it. He's got a whole great book, definitely. Nope, she was born here and she moved to Oregon.
Yeah, but she came back here, or did she stay there?
She stayed there.
Oh.
Yeah, she did not come back. Question in the back?
Just
Sure.
so I'm sort of a child in Bedford, New York, and then spent 5 years in Portland, Oregon.
Nice.
Where I was pretty active in both radical politics in Portland, in labor politics. And I have to say, I really never heard that much about Marie Equi and either the Oregon
Yeah.
or the Bedford roots. So this is really informative and very educational. And I just wanted to, the question I wanted to ask was, do we know whether there was much printed about her life in Oregon in the Bedford media?
There was some, yes. There's a couple of pieces that are pretty, I would say infamous is the right word. Marie wasn't happy with the depictions the New Bedford Press gave her usually. So I would take them with a grain of salt, along with most of the public documents about Marie Equi, including the deposition and trial documents from her federal trial. But you can see clearly in all of the written documents of her life that she was a contentious figure on all sides. Even the people she loved and was closest to found her to be a complex individual, I think is the right way to say it. Don?
Question from the virtual audience.
Question from the virtual audience.
So Mandy says, greetings from Key Largo.
Hello, Key Largo.
Great presentation. Do you know Betsy Outless?
There was, to bring it right back to our previous conversation, a message in the newspaper that Marie Equi had arrived and was looking for her friend. Marie Equi is a bold character. You can find her, you simply must look. And that is a really good way to talk about her and queer history in general, I think.
But I'm mad.
Another question?
So,
I noticed that she has had a sister named Kate
Mhm.
who was in school, I think it said in that information. that you had.
Yeah,
Do you know anything about Kate? I mean, did she, the elder sister?
Yeah, it
Kate
seems
in some way?
most of her family stayed around here. She did have some relatives in California already when she moved out west that she was mildly in touch with, and her adopted daughter Mary was in touch with that family. And so they were also Italian family related to John Equi, who lived out west. I think they were his cousin or something. And so there are definitely some descendants of her family, absolutely. And I just haven't had the chance to dig that broadly yet. Really just pulling out of that first chapter in Michael Helquist's book where he like kind of breezes over New Bedford. And I'm like, yeah, I understand, but I'm like teasing out these little bits because I'm in New Bedford all the time. I'm like, this street, this building, what did Marie think? You know, it's that kind of thing. So working through her siblings' school records or mill records is definitely the next step. And maybe if I can find some of her younger siblings and younger cousins information, it's probably a little easier. From what I can tell, almost nothing remains of Marie's documents in places that are known to be looked in.
How old was she when
She was just about 20 years old. She left in 1892, born in 1872.
If you're ever looking for where she's entombed, get a map. Looks small on the outside, it's gargantuan on the inside. Get a map. Don't get
I
lost.
sent my friends on a wild goose chase when they were in Portland. I was like, go find her grave. Anything else you folks have questions on tonight?
What was the spelling of the author's last name?
Helquist, Helquist. Yeah, absolutely. And if we still want to talk, these are the things I would ask Dr. Equi if I could talk to her right now, but I'll ask you instead if you feel like still hanging out to chat. If there's no more questions.